You never forget the day your life is split in two, before and after the world turns against you. The town of Dusty Bend simmered with heat
Find Rosalie.
and gossip that
Go
afternoon.
on, boy, find her.
The 4th of July fairgrounds had always been Rosalie Boone's favorite place as a child. She used to chase wild ponies by the corral, skinned knees peeking from beneath calico skirts, her laugh as clear as the creek in spring. But today, the flags on Main Street felt like judges' banners, and the crowd that once cheered her father's horses now whispered her name like a curse. The Boone family, wealthy, powerful, proud, stood in the center of it all. Rosalie's father, Judge Boone, his mustache waxed and black boots polished, held himself like a king. His eyes never softened, not even for his own blood. He was the kind of man who believed life was meant to be ruled by those with iron will and a heavy hand. As townsfolk gathered, shopkeepers, ranchers, young wives in sunbonnets, boys with slingshots tucked in their pockets, Rosalie tried to fade into the dust. She was 23 but felt much older, every freckle and flaw magnified by the stares and the hissing of rumors. "Folks," Judge Boone called, voice booming over the square, "I've come today to address a shame brought on my household by my own daughter. She has failed her family, and by doing so, shamed herself before God and neighbor." A hush fell. Rosalie stood rigid, hands balled into fists at her sides. She knew this was coming, had known for weeks, ever since the judge found her at the old windmill with the forbidden letter in her hand. A letter never meant for him to see. But she hadn't imagined he would drag her before the entire town. "Rosalie Boone is no longer a Boone," he declared, each word landing like a slap. "From this day she is banished from my house and my name. She is no daughter of mine." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people, like Mrs. Murdoch from the bakery, looked away, faces pinched with pity. Others, like old Mr. Cardwell, looked on with grim satisfaction, eager for the spectacle. "Is this necessary, Judge?" Someone called out from the crowd, but the judge shot him a glare sharp enough to slice. Rosalie's legs trembled, but she would not fall. She forced herself to look her father in the eye, even as tears burned her vision. She would not give him the satisfaction. But Judge Boone wasn't finished. "A girl who will not honor her kin is fit only for servitude. So let her serve. Let her learn humility as the wife of a man as low as she has sunk." He swept an arm toward the edge of the crowd. There stood Calvin Reed, thin, sunburned, wearing patched trousers and a faded shirt. He was the orphaned ranch hand who did the work no one else wanted. His hands were scarred from barbed wire and broken horses. He looked just as shocked as Rosalie. "From this hour, Rosalie Boone is to be the wife of Calvin Reed," the judge spat. "And leave this town at once." The crowd burst into a low buzz. Whispers flew. "Did you hear? She's being given away like a stray dog, to that nobody." Calvin stepped forward, his jaw tight. He looked at Rosalie, then at the judge, struggling for words. "Sir, I never—" "Enough!" Judge Boone thundered. "You'll take her, Reed, or you'll leave this county for good. I won't have either of you here to poison the air." Rosalie looked at Calvin, her heart hammering. She'd spoken to him maybe twice before. Once when he mended a fence near the Boone barn. Another time when he offered her his hat during a sudden rainstorm. He had always seemed gentle, an outsider in his own right. But this was a punishment for them both. "Come on, girl," the judge snapped. "Let's see how proud you are now." Someone shoved a tattered bundle into her arms, her belongings thrown together without care. Rosalie could barely stand. Her world had collapsed in the space of a few minutes. Still, she managed a shaky nod. Calvin moved closer, uncertain but determined. He offered his arm. Rosalie hesitated. Then, with the last ounce of dignity she could muster, she accepted. As they walked through the jeering crowd, someone spat at her boots. Another person laughed, but most people were silent, ashamed or afraid. At the edge of the square, Rosalie dared one last look over her shoulder. Her father's back was already turned. Her mother, hidden behind a lace fan, did not meet her eyes. A wagon waited. Calvin helped her up, then climbed beside her, gripping the reins with knuckles white as bone. Rusty, Calvin's loyal old dog, trotted after them. The wagon creaked away from Dusty Bend, leaving behind everything Rosalie had ever known. As the town faded in the dust, Rosalie swallowed her grief. She would not weep. She would not beg. Her old life was gone, ripped away in the heat of public humiliation. All she had left was the unknown prairie ahead, a stranger beside her, and the echo of her father's final words ringing in her ears. But as the wagon bumped along the rutted trail, a new thought flickered beneath the pain. Maybe this was the start of something she could claim for herself, beyond the reach of those who would decide her worth. The first miles out of Dusty Bend dragged slow as sorrow. Rosalie sat rigid on the splintered wagon seat, clutching her battered bundle, while the landscape rolled by in a blur of gold and rust. Her thoughts felt too heavy for words, humiliation still raw, anger simmering just beneath her skin, and a numbness she couldn't quite shake. Beside her, Calvin Reed kept his eyes on the horizon, lips pressed in a thin, uncertain line. Even the dog, Rusty, padded along in silence, tongue lolling, ears perked as if listening for threats that might yet follow. The road twisted west, out past the last line of cottonwoods, until the only sign of civilization was the distant thread of smoke from some far-off rancher's cookfire. The silence grew thick. Rosalie heard every squeak of the wagon, every creak of the harness, every awkward breath. She'd grown up with servants, siblings, and neighbors always within shouting distance. Out here, the prairie seemed to swallow sound and hope alike. She stole a glance at Calvin. His hair was sandy, hat battered, shirt sun-faded and tucked into patched work trousers. His hands, she noticed now, were rough and stained, more used to rope and plow than to kindness. Yet he didn't look at her with the triumph or resentment she'd half expected. Instead, there was only an anxious gentleness, as if he too were bracing for a storm. Finally, as they crested a rise and the wind caught her hair, Calvin cleared his throat. "We're almost there. It ain't much, but it's home to me." Rosalie stared ahead. A cluster of cottonwoods sheltered a small, lopsided shack with a stone chimney, windows clouded by dust and age. A tiny corral leaned drunkenly behind the house, its rails mended with wire and hope. There was no grand gate, no whitewashed fence, no hired hands, just the bare bones of survival and a patch of earth that looked wrestled from the wild. Calvin pulled the wagon to a stop. "I know it ain't what you're used to," he said quietly. "I'll do my best to, I'll try to make you comfortable. You can have the inside room, if you like. I'll sleep out by the fire. You don't need to worry." His awkwardness was almost painful. For a moment, Rosalie wanted to lash out, to spit words as sharp as her father's had been. But as she climbed down and felt her boots sink into the dust, Exhaustion softened her anger. She could not find the strength to fight him. She just wanted a bed and a moment to breathe. Inside, the shack was small but tidy. There were hand-patched curtains, a chipped blue pitcher on the table, and a woven rug faded by the sun. It was not a prison, nor was it a home. It was a question, a challenge she'd never asked for. Calvin brought in her bundle and set it on a rickety stool. "If you need anything, just ask. There's a pump out back for water. Wood stacked by the stove. I'll be outside." He retreated, shoulders hunched, leaving Rosalie alone with the creaking timbers and the faint smell of coffee grounds. She dropped her bundle and sank onto the narrow bed. For a long while, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant caw of crows. Out the window, she could see Calvin busying himself with chores, splitting wood, checking on a skinny horse in the corral, talking to Rusty as if the dog were his only friend in the world. He never once looked her way. That, somehow, hurt most of all. As dusk settled, the prairie glowed with the soft fire of sunset. The shadows grew long, painting the shack in amber and violet. Rosalie found herself restless. Wandering outside just as Calvin finished hauling water, he nodded, awkward as ever. "Supper's almost ready. Just beans and bread. Hope that's all right." She watched him fumble with the pot, moving with the careful clumsiness of a man who rarely cooked for company. A pang of guilt flickered through her. For all his roughness, Calvin was trying, even if he didn't know how. Supper was eaten in silence, interrupted only by Rusty's hopeful tail thumping against the table. Rosalie nibbled her bread, stomach tight with nerves. When she reached for the salt, their hands brushed, and both jerked back as if burned. She almost laughed at how ridiculous it all was. Two strangers bound by shame and circumstance, trying to pretend this was normal. Afterward, Calvin washed the dishes while Rosalie lingered at the door, watching stars blink to life across the sky. The vastness pressed on her, equal parts frightening and freeing. She felt impossibly small, just another exile under a universe that didn't care who she'd been or who she'd become. That night, as Calvin spread his bedroll by the dying embers and Rusty curled up at his feet, Rosalie lay awake, staring at the moonlit ceiling. She tried to remember the last time she'd felt safe. She wondered what tomorrow would bring, if kindness would bloom in this unlikely soil, or if exile would grind her spirit down. Bit by bit, sleep came in fits, full of dreams of home and the echo of her father's condemnation. But beneath the fear, a stubborn ember of defiance flickered. She was more than her family's cast-off. She was still alive, still breathing, still here. And though the prairie seemed endless and the future uncertain, Rosalie Boone, outcast, exile, survivor, would not break. Not tonight. Rosalie Boone woke before dawn, startled from a restless sleep by the strange symphony of prairie morning, coyotes howling faint in the distance, a meadowlark's piercing call, and the soft scraping of Calvin Reed's boots outside. She lay still a moment, gathering herself. In her old life, servants had started the day. In this new one, she'd have to find her own way. She washed her face at the pump, shivering in the chill. Her hands, soft and unused to work, fumbled with the icy handle. The cold shocked her awake. By the time she entered the kitchen, Calvin was already stoking the fire, the scent of bitter coffee drifting through the little shack. "Morning," he said, glancing up but not pushing conversation. Rosalie nodded, feeling the weight of silence press on them both. She'd never been much of a cook, but hunger overruled her pride. With stiff hands, she managed to slice a loaf of bread, drop it in the pan, and burn the first piece black. Embarrassed, she scraped the charred edges, pretending not to notice Calvin's glance. Calvin didn't laugh or scold. Instead, he reached for the pan. "Try turning it down a bit. Stove runs hot in the morning. Happens to everybody." He said it gently, no hint of mockery. For a man who'd just had a wife forced on him, he showed more patience than she'd expected. After breakfast, the work began. Rosalie followed Calvin into the corral, where his single, skinny mare nickered, tossing her tangled mane. "She's called Maple," Calvin said, stroking the horse's nose. "A bit high-strung. Like someone else I know." Rosalie snorted despite herself. "Careful, she bites." Calvin only grinned, handing her a brush. "Best way to make friends with a horse is to try. Just slow, gentle strokes, like this." She watched his hands. Steady, certain, kind. She tried to copy, but the brush clattered from her fingers, landing in the dust. Maple jerked back, nostrils flaring. "Easy," Calvin soothed, steadying both horse and human. "Takes time, Rosalie. She's stubborn, but she'll come round." "So will I," Rosalie thought, swallowing a lump in her throat. The day crawled by in fits and starts. Calvin showed her how to haul water, mend a torn shirt, patch a fence post. When she jabbed her thumb with the needle and cursed under her breath, Calvin bit back a laugh, but didn't correct her. Instead, he wrapped her finger in a strip of clean rag and set her loose to try again. By noon, sweat dripped down her neck, and her arms ached from work she'd never known before. She resented the blisters, the grime beneath her nails, and most of all, the gnawing shame every time she failed. Each small failure reminded her of her father's words, of the crowd's laughter as she was exiled. But the prairie had its own rhythm, stubborn and slow. After lunch, Rosalie found herself on the porch, watching dust devils spin across the empty land. Calvin brought her a mug of cool water, sitting a safe distance away. "You don't have to like it here," he said, staring out at the horizon. "I know this ain't what you wanted. Hell, it's not what I wanted either. But maybe we can make the best of it for a while." Rosalie didn't answer, but she looked at him, really looked, and saw not a captor, but a companion in misfortune. They were both outcasts in their own way. She saw his awkwardness, the uncertainty in his posture, the hope he kept hidden. It made something inside her soften just a little. The rest of the afternoon passed in a series of small trials. Calvin taught her to ride Maple, holding the reins as she climbed, steadying her when she slipped. The mare tossed her head and nearly bucked, but Rosalie gripped tighter, refusing to fall. Calvin cheered her on, quiet and sincere. "That's it. You're stronger than you think." For the first time, Rosalie allowed herself to laugh, breathless, shaky, but real. Maple settled under her, and for a fleeting moment, she felt something like freedom, wind in her hair, worries left behind in the rush of hooves. But as dusk settled, bringing long shadows and the sound of crickets, the fatigue returned, heavier than before. Rosalie tried to fix supper, a stew she'd watched her mother's cook prepare 100 times. The result was a lumpy, tasteless mess. She stared at the pot, eyes prickling with tears, and felt the walls closing in. Calvin tasted the stew, then set down his spoon. He didn't criticize, didn't push the bowl away. He just smiled, slow and warm. "We'll get better at this together. Takes practice, that's all." The simple words, kind, patient, undeserved, were too much. Rosalie broke down, tears spilling down her cheeks in fat, silent drops. She turned away, humiliated by her own weakness. But Calvin just set his hand on her shoulder. Not forceful, not possessive, just a gentle weight, anchoring her in the storm. "You're not alone out here, Rosalie. We're both learning. It's okay to fall apart. Just means you're trying." His words, awkward but sincere, cut through her defenses. She let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since the public shaming, sobs shaking her whole body. Calvin didn't rush her or pull away. He sat with her until the tears faded, and when she finally met his eyes, there was something new between them. Respect, fragile but real. That night, as the prairie wind whistled around the shack, Rosalie crawled beneath her quilt. Still shaken but less afraid. She'd survived another day, not because she was strong, but because someone believed she could be. For the first time, the exile felt less like a punishment and more like the beginning of something unknown, something maybe even worth fighting for. And as she drifted into sleep, Rosalie Boone felt a small, stubborn hope take root in the ashes of her old life. Days on the prairie moved with an odd rhythm, sunrise to sunset. The endless labor of survival, the slow, grudging growth of trust between Rosalie and Calvin. By the second week, blisters had turned to calluses, and Rosalie found herself anticipating the quiet peace of Calvin's company as much as she dreaded the chores. Sometimes, in the violet hush before dawn, she'd catch him watching the horizon, lost in thought, and she'd wonder what loneliness lived inside him. But even as the land grew familiar, a chill crept in with the wind. It began with a strange unease, small things, easily dismissed. A fence post knocked loose in the night, boot prints in the mud near the shed that neither of them recognized. The horses startled by shadows, Rusty growling at empty air. At first, Rosalie tried to convince herself it was her imagination. After all, she'd never lived this far from the safety of town. But one morning, while sweeping the porch, she found a slip of paper tucked beneath a loose board. Her name was scrawled across the top in an unfamiliar, jagged hand. "You can't run from blood debts. Come home, Rosalie, or pay for your father's sins." The words chilled her to the bone. She crumpled the note in her fist and pressed her back to the wall, heart pounding. The land was supposed to be her refuge. Punishment, yes, but at least free of her father's poison. Now, it seemed, his reach extended farther than she'd dreamed. When Calvin came in from the barn, she thrust the note at him. He read it in silence, jaw tightening, then folded it neatly and slid it into his pocket. "I'll keep watch tonight," he said quietly. "Don't worry. No one's getting past Rusty, not while I'm here." His calm steadied her, but a shadow lingered. That night she barely slept, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, the distant howl of coyotes echoing her fear. The next day brought more trouble. As Calvin rode into town for supplies, Rosalie busied herself with chores, trying to keep her mind from spiraling. Just after midday, she heard hoofbeats, heavy, purposeful, approaching fast. She grabbed the old rifle Calvin kept by the door, hands shaking so badly she could hardly hold it. A tall figure dismounted, dust rising from his boots. He wore a deputy's badge tarnished with age and a sheriff's star pinned just above it. The way he swaggered told her everything she needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Rosalie Boone," he said, doffing his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Or should I say, Mrs. Reed? My name's Colton Vane. I keep the law around these parts." His smile was all teeth, eyes cold and hungry. Rosalie gripped the rifle tighter. "What do you want?" she demanded, forcing steel into her voice. He took his time, letting the silence draw out. "I'm here on business. Seems your daddy's gotten himself into a bit of trouble. Gambling debts, mostly. Lot of people in town are owed money, and the barons, well, they're tired of waiting. Boone's run out of excuses, but he sure hasn't run out of daughters." Rosalie's stomach lurched. "I have nothing to do with his debts." Vane's smile widened. "Maybe not, but you sure do make a tempting bit of collateral. Pretty girl like you, married to a nobody out on the prairie? Real easy for something bad to happen. Unless, of course, you help pay off what's owed." He took a step closer, voice dropping. "The land barons want their due. Either you come with me, quiet, no fuss, or you find a way to come up with your daddy's money. You got until sundown tomorrow." Rosalie glared at him, refusing to flinch. "I'm not going anywhere. If you come near me again, you'll regret it." Vane's eyes narrowed, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the malice underneath. "You've got a mouth on you, but don't think your little husband can protect you. Men have disappeared out here for less." With that, he tipped his hat and strode back to his horse. Mounting in one fluid motion, Rusty barked and chased after him, nipping at his boots, but the sheriff didn't look back. Rosalie slumped against the door, trembling with rage and fear. The moment Calvin returned, she told him everything. Vane's threats, her father's debts, the ultimatum. Calvin's face darkened with anger. "He's a snake, that Vane. Always has been. Used to work for the barons before the badge. He can't touch you. Not if I've got anything to say about it." That night, they barricaded the doors and windows, Rusty sleeping at the foot of Rosalie's bed, Calvin sitting up with the rifle in his lap. Outside, the prairie was silent, but the tension inside the shack hummed like a live wire. They talked in hushed voices as the lantern burned low. For the first time, Rosalie told Calvin about her childhood, how her father's pride always came first, how she'd learned to hide her true self, how loneliness had been her only constant. Calvin listened, eyes kind and thoughtful, and then shared his own story, a life of loss and hard luck, drifting from ranch to ranch until he landed here, alone but free. By dawn, exhaustion claimed them both, but something had changed. The threat of Sheriff Vane and the barons hung over them like storm clouds, but in the sharing of their scars, Rosalie and Calvin found new strength. They would not be cowed by men who ruled by fear. Together, they would face whatever came, no matter the odds. As the sun crept over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of hope and warning, Rosalie gazed out the window, jaw set. Her exile was no longer just punishment. It was a battle for survival, and she had no intention of losing. Rosalie didn't realize how much she'd begun to rely on the thin security of Calvin's little homestead until it was ripped away. For days after Sheriff Colton Vane's visit, she and Calvin moved like sentries around the place. Windows double-checked, doors locked, rifles loaded and close at hand. The prairie air itself seemed different, charged with invisible danger. Rusty, the loyal dog, patrolled the yard, nose low to the ground, growling at every drifting scent. But there's only so much a body can endure. The constant tension wore at Rosalie's nerves, until every creak of the shack felt like a threat, and every shadow in the dusk looked like an enemy. Calvin tried to reassure her, but even he was jumpier than usual, speaking in half-whispers and glancing over his shoulder as he chopped wood. It was on the fourth night, with the moon hidden behind a bank of clouds and the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls, that it happened. Rosalie had just finished clearing the supper dishes when she heard the horses, 2, maybe 3, approaching fast from the south. Rusty shot up, hackles raised, and let out a low, warning growl. Calvin was already reaching for the rifle when the front door exploded inward, slammed by a booted foot. 3 men stormed in, faces half-masked with bandanas, the smell of sweat and leather clinging to them. The leader, tall, with a red scar running down his jaw, shoved Calvin hard, sending him sprawling against the stove. Rusty lunged, teeth bared, but the second man cracked him across the muzzle with a stick, sending the dog yelping and limping away. Rosalie tried to run, but the third man grabbed her, pinning her arms. She fought, kicking, twisting, refusing to make it easy, but he was strong and mean. He twisted her wrist until she cried out. Calvin struggled to his feet, eyes blazing with fury. "Let her go!" he shouted, voice hoarse. The leader laughed, swinging the rifle toward Calvin. "You want her? Come and get her, Reed! Orders are clear. Bring the girl back. Sheriff's waiting." Rosalie's heart hammered. She recognized the voice. One of Vane's men, a regular fixture in her father's gambling circle. The betrayal stung. These men had once eaten at her father's table. "Don't you dare touch her!" Calvin lunged, but the second man swung a fist, catching him in the ribs. Calvin dropped to his knees, gasping. The men dragged Rosalie out the door, ignoring her screams and Rusty's desperate barking. She dug her heels into the dirt, but it was no use. They hauled her onto a waiting horse, tying her hands, and threw a rough blanket over her head. She caught a final glimpse of Calvin, bloody-lipped, struggling to rise, reaching for her with an agony she felt mirrored in her own chest. Then the night swallowed her, all sound muffled by the thundering of hooves. They rode for hours, jostling over uneven ground. Rosalie lost track of time, lost track of direction. The men said little, except to spit cruel jokes about teaching her a lesson and making sure the barons got their money's worth. Every word added fuel to the burning knot of fear in her belly. At last, they stopped. Rough hands dragged her from the horse and shoved her into what felt like a dilapidated shed or outpost. The air stank of mildew and old tobacco. Someone lit a lantern, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. The men tied her to a support beam, then slumped by the door, drinking and playing cards, half watching her with ugly, lazy interest. Rosalie struggled against the ropes, wrists burning, tears threatened, but she fought them down. She refused to be a victim. Instead, she listened, marking the men's patterns, counting the steps from door to beam, memorizing the sound of their voices. Survival, she told herself. That's all that mattered. Meanwhile, back at the shack, Calvin was picking himself up off the floor. His ribs throbbed, blood dripped from his split lip, and his heart was beating out of his chest. Rusty whined and nuzzled at his hand, licking his face. "Good boy," Calvin muttered, running a shaky hand through the dog's fur. "We're not giving up. Not now." He checked the door, half off its hinges, and cursed. The tracks outside were clear, fresh hoof prints and a boot print deep in the mud. Calvin grabbed his coat, his hat, and the rifle. He knelt beside Rusty, speaking low and urgent. "Find Rosalie. Go on, boy, find her." Rusty sniffed the air, tail wagging, then darted ahead, nose to the ground. Calvin followed, lungs burning, eyes straining to see in the half-dark. They moved fast, following the trail across the wild prairie, through gullies, across a shallow stream, up a ridge pockmarked with brush and scree. The night was full of dangers, rattlesnakes, hidden holes, the ever-present threat of running into Vane's men again. But Calvin pressed on, thoughts only of Rosalie. At one point he stumbled, nearly twisting his ankle, but Rusty barked encouragement, leading him on. Just before dawn, they found the outpost. Calvin crouched in the brush, heart in his throat, and watched as the men inside grew rowdy and careless, laughing at some crude story. He spotted Rosalie, bound, bruised but defiant, meeting his eyes through the cracks in the wall. Calvin waited for his moment. When two of the men stumbled outside to relieve themselves, Calvin crept up, rifle at the ready, Rusty flanking him. He knocked one out with the butt of the gun and sent Rusty after the other, whose screams echoed in the pre-dawn quiet. Inside, the leader lunged for Rosalie, knife raised, but Calvin fired a warning shot, splintering the doorframe and sending the man sprawling. "Don't you dare!" Calvin roared. The leader hesitated, eyes wild, then bolted for the window. Calvin rushed to Rosalie, cutting her free. She threw her arms around him, sobs of relief shaking her whole body. Together, they stumbled out into the gray dawn, Rusty circling protectively. Behind them, the outpost burned as Calvin, before leaving, tossed the lantern into a pile of rags, a warning to Vane and his men. No one would take Rosalie Boone again without a fight. As the sun broke over the horizon, Calvin and Rosalie limped homeward, battered but unbroken. Each step was a promise. They would never surrender to fear, and they would never face the darkness alone. The prairie felt different after the kidnapping, haunted, charged with memories of violence and escape. Rosalie and Calvin returned to their shack as dawn painted the sky with streaks of pale gold, each of them battered but changed. Their exhaustion was bone deep, but there was no time to rest. They knew Vane's men would come looking again, and maybe this time they wouldn't survive. That threat hung over them like a gathering storm. Rosalie tried to move through the morning as if it were any other day, but every creak of the floorboards and every distant hoofbeat set her heart racing. Calvin was quieter than usual, his jaw clenched as he checked the windows and doors, packing what little food and ammunition they had into a battered rucksack. Rusty kept close to Rosalie, never letting her out of sight. When the midday sun cast sharp shadows across the yard, Calvin came to her, voice tense but gentle. "We can't stay. Not now. We'll head for the canyon. There's caves out that way. Hard to find, even harder to follow. We'll lay low until we figure out our next move." Rosalie nodded, fear twisting her insides. She gathered what little she could carry, a threadbare shawl, a battered locket from her childhood, and the old rifle Calvin pressed into her hands. They set out, leaving behind the only shelter they'd known, crossing the wide, exposed prairie. Every step away from the shack felt like another thread snapping from her old life, and Rosalie found herself grieving not for the Boone mansion, but for the tiny, scrappy home she and Calvin had begun to build together, however imperfect. The journey was grueling. The wind whipped up dust, stinging their faces. They followed a dry creek bed, then scrambled over rocky ground, always listening for hoofbeats or the barked commands of men sent to hunt them. As the sun dipped low, painting the canyon walls in blood and copper, Calvin finally signaled for them to stop. He led Rosalie through a narrow gap in the rocks, down into a ravine, nearly swallowed by tangled sage and prickly pear. There, hidden by nature's own defenses, was the dark mouth of a cave. "We'll camp here," Calvin whispered. "It's not much, but it's safer than the open." Inside, the cave smelled of earth and damp stone. Rosalie could barely see, but she felt her way along the cool wall, heart pounding. Calvin struck a match, lighting a stub of candle, and the feeble glow revealed not just stone, but movement in the shadows. A voice echoed from the darkness, steady, low, and unmistakably female. "Put that light out. You'll draw every buzzard for miles." Calvin froze. Rosalie gripped the rifle tighter. Out from the back of the cave stepped a young woman, maybe a year or two older than Rosalie, with a tangled mass of dark hair, wary eyes, and a battered coat several sizes too big. She carried a knife at her belt and moved with a wildcat's grace. "Name's Clara," she said, keeping her distance. "I heard the trouble out on the plain. Figured someone would come running this way sooner or later." Before Rosalie or Calvin could reply, a second figure emerged. A boy, barely 15, limping and holding a makeshift crutch. His eyes darted between them, fearful but curious. "We're not here to cause trouble," Calvin said quietly. "Just need a place to hide. Vane's men." He didn't have to finish. Clara's eyes darkened in understanding. "Vane's a bastard," she spat. "You're not the first to run from him, or from the families that pay him. You two got lucky. Most don't get away." Rosalie stared, hope flickering in her chest. "There are more of you?" Clara nodded. "Not just me and Sam here. There's a whole warren of caves. Women, kids, even a few old hands that crossed the wrong land baron. We help each other when we can. Not much, but it's something." A strange relief flooded Rosalie. For the first time since her exile, she was not alone. Not the only one hunted, betrayed, or cast out. She and Calvin followed Clara deeper into the warren, their candle flickering over narrow passages and hollowed-out rooms where makeshift beds, food stores, and battered belongings told the stories of those who'd fled before them. They met others: Margaret, a widow whose ranch was stolen after her husband's accident; Ruth and Annabelle, sisters whose father had sold them to settle debts; Big Joe, a mountain of a man whose only crime was standing up to a foreman. Every face carried a history of pain and survival. Every story reminded Rosalie that Dusty Ben's respectability was built on the bones of those it cast aside. Clara handed Rosalie a crust of bread and a battered cup of water. "Stay as long as you need," she said. "But watch your back. The barons send patrols through the canyon sometimes. We've got scouts, but it's never truly safe." As night settled over the canyon, Rosalie sat beside a tiny fire, listening to the murmur of voices echoing off the stone. She felt the weight of her father's betrayal and Vane's threats, but here, in the shelter of the outcasts, she also felt a stubborn ember of hope. Calvin squeezed her hand, offering silent comfort. "We'll get through this," he promised, voice raw with emotion. "We've got friends now. We're not fighting alone anymore." And as Rosalie looked around the flickering cave, at faces marked by hardship but alive with determination, she realized she believed him. Exile had forced her into the darkness, but here, among allies, she saw the first sparks of something she'd never truly known: belonging. The world outside was dangerous, yes. But here in the shadows, a different kind of family was growing. One bound not by blood or power, but by the fierce will to survive. To protect one another, and maybe, just maybe, to strike back. Life in the caves was a world apart from anything Rosalie had ever known. There were no locked doors, no grand speeches or polite lies, just survival and the unlikely kinship of outcasts drawn together by desperation and hope. The walls themselves seemed to echo with stories, laughter, weeping, and the clatter of tin cups as people gathered for meager meals. Yet for all the hardship, There was something fiercely alive in that darkness, a stubborn insistence on dignity that would not be crushed by the barons or their thugs. Rosalie found herself changing. The spoiled, uncertain girl banished by her father seemed to dissolve in the dim glow of the fires. Each day she learned new skills: how to move silently along narrow ledges, how to listen for the approach of danger, how to comfort a terrified child or treat a festering wound. Clara was both mentor and friend, teaching her how to track the patrols, forage for edible roots, and make a weapon out of a stick and a stone. The stories shared in those caverns were heavier than any burden Rosalie had ever borne. Margaret spoke of watching her home burn as Vane's men laughed. Ruth and Annabel whispered of nights spent hiding from men who saw them only as debts to be traded. Even Calvin, so steady on the surface, confessed how his orphaned years had taught him to expect nothing from anyone but a loyal dog. Yet, as the weeks passed, it was Rosalie who surprised them all. She began to see the patterns: how Vane's patrols always followed the same route, how supplies moved along predictable paths from the land barons' storehouses to their private bunkhouses. She watched, listened, and started to ask questions that no one else dared voice. "Why do we always run?" she asked one night, her voice clear in the hush. "Why don't we make them afraid for once?" At first, her words met only silence. But Clara's eyes shone with something like pride. "What are you thinking?" she asked, voice low but electric. Rosalie hesitated, feeling the eyes of the group upon her. "We're strong together. We know these hills better than Vane's men do. If we strike at their supplies, free the captives they're holding, maybe sabotage a wagon or two, it would show them we're not just prey." There was a tense moment. Big Joe grunted. "That's trouble you're asking for, Miss Boone. Men have been hanged for less." "I know," Rosalie replied, "but we're already hunted. Hiding hasn't made us safe. I say it's time we give them a reason to remember our names." Calvin looked at her with new respect. He squeezed her hand, nodding. "I'll stand with you. Whatever you decide." The others mulled it over, doubts swirling with hope. Margaret was the first to break the quiet. "If it means no more children taken in the night, I'll help." So it began. They spent days planning, mapping routes in the dust, memorizing the patrol schedules. Clara and Calvin scouted the barren's supply wagons, marking where they crossed the dry creek bed. The younger boys, including Sam, kept watch for strangers near the canyon's entrance. Rosalie found herself at the center of it all, her courage and clarity drawing people in. She was no longer just the daughter of a powerful man or the exile forced into servitude. She was something else entirely. With Clara and Calvin at her side, she led late-night raids on the barren stores, cutting harnesses and scattering horses, stealing food and medicine for the cave dwellers. Each small victory brought new confidence. The first time they freed a captive, a battered woman bound for the baron's house, Rosalie felt a wild, joyous relief she had never known. They brought her back to the caves, where she was welcomed as family, her wounds tended, her dignity restored. Word spread quickly. Others found their way to the canyon, following rumors of a secret refuge, and the caves grew crowded with the voices of the newly brave. But there were setbacks, too. One night, a patrol nearly caught Calvin and Clara as they set fire to a storage shed. They escaped only by ducking into a flooded ravine, shivering and bruised. Another time, Annabel was grazed by a bullet while fleeing from a supply raid. Each brush with danger left the group shaken, but Rosalie refused to let despair take hold. "Fear is what they want," she told the gathered outcasts, her voice rising strong and clear. If we let it break us, we're already lost. But if we stand together, if we refuse to be silent, there's nothing they can do to stop us. Her words worked a kind of magic. Even the oldest, most broken among them straightened their backs, finding pride in their defiance. The caves buzzed with energy, hope glowing like coals ready to ignite. And Rosalie, awkward, flawed, still haunted by her father's betrayal, became in that darkness a leader. There were still nights when doubt gnawed at her. When she lay awake listening to the wind moan through the canyons, she wondered if she was leading them to freedom or to doom. But each morning brought new resolve, new acts of bravery. Each small rebellion, each captive freed, each wagon sabotaged, each meal shared, drew them closer, binding them as a family forged not by blood, but by courage and necessity. And as word spread across the prairie of a band of outcasts striking back, Rosalie Boone realized something extraordinary. She had found her voice. She had found her people. And for the first time, she believed they could win. The rebellion in the shadows could not stay hidden forever. Each raid, each stolen supply, each captive freed sent ripples across the prairie, ripples that reached the wrong ears. The land barons, furious at the loss of their property and their pride, demanded action. Sheriff Colton Vane, with his ego bruised and his authority questioned, vowed to crush the band of outcasts that had embarrassed him in front of the powerful families. Rosalie knew the reckoning was coming. For days, scouts in the caves reported increased patrols and strangers riding the high ridges. Clara caught a pair of Vane's men sniffing around the canyon entrance. They left with black eyes and empty saddlebags, but the message was clear. The barons were getting desperate. On a moonless night, as thunderheads gathered over the prairie, the group huddled deep in the caves, planning their next move. Calvin's voice was steady but grim. "They'll keep coming. It's only a matter of time before they flush us out." "We could move deeper into the hills," Margaret whispered, voice trembling. Rosalie shook her head. "They'll hunt us to the ends of the earth. We can't just keep running. If we fight them now, at a place of our choosing, we might just have a chance." Clara jabbed a finger at the map scratched in the dust. "There's an old mine, Red Hollow, out past the dry creek. It's abandoned, half collapsed, but there's only one way in or out. If we make our stand there, maybe we can hold them off long enough for the others to escape." No one liked the idea of a trap, but the alternative, being picked off one by one, was worse. That night, they packed what they could and moved through the darkness. Children carried on backs, wounded bundled gently, hearts pounding with fear and hope. Red Hollow Mine loomed at dawn, its weathered timbers creaking in the wind. The old rail track twisted and rusted. The group took shelter inside, setting up barricades with broken carts and piles of rock. Rosalie paced the entrance, rifle slung across her shoulder, mind racing. Calvin joined her, eyes full of worry. "We don't have to do this," he said softly. "We could still run, hide, try again somewhere else." Rosalie shook her head. "I'm tired of running, Calvin, aren't you? For once I want to choose where I stand. If we lose, at least we did it on our terms." He squeezed her hand, his love and fear unspoken. "Whatever happens, I'll be beside you." By noon, the dust on the horizon told them Vane was coming. Riders, at least a dozen, maybe more, approached at a gallop, guns gleaming, faces masked and hard. Sheriff Vane rode at the front, his badge catching the sun, his voice carried across the dry air. "Rosalie Boone, You and your little gang come out now, and maybe I'll let you live." Inside the mine, the outcasts tensed. Big Joe hefted a pickaxe. Margaret clutched a pistol with shaking hands. Clara crouched by a pile of stones ready to throw. Rosalie stepped into the mine entrance, rifle at her shoulder. Her voice rang clear and strong. "You'll get nothing from us, Vane. Not me. Not any of these people. You want a fight? Come and take it." Vane's eyes narrowed, his face twisting with rage. He signaled to his men, and suddenly the quiet morning erupted into violence. Bullets tore through the barricades, splinters flying. Calvin returned fire, steady and unafraid, his face grim with resolve. Clara darted from cover to cover, tossing rocks that sent men reeling from their saddles. Big Joe bellowed, swinging his pickaxe at the first attacker who tried to breach the entrance. The fighting was fierce and desperate. The Baron's men pressed forward, thinking the outcasts would break, but they found themselves met with a fury they hadn't expected. Rosalie shot true, dropping one of Vane's lieutenants before he could climb the rails. Margaret, despite trembling hands, managed to wound another, her shot echoing through the tunnels. At one point, Vane himself stormed inside, gun drawn, eyes burning with hatred. He found Rosalie alone, cut off from the others, standing her ground in the half-light of the mine's entrance. He sneered. "You think you're special, girl? You're nothing without your daddy's name, just a spoiled brat playing at hero." Rosalie's hands trembled, but she lifted her chin, voice steady. "You don't get to decide who I am, Colton. Not you, not my father, not anybody. I choose for myself now." Vane lunged. But Rosalie fired, the bullet grazing his arm and sending his gun skittering across the stone. In the chaos, Calvin tackled Vane from behind, the two men crashing to the ground in a tangle of fists and fury. Clara and Margaret rushed to Rosalie's side, forming a wall between her and the danger. The tide began to turn. One by one, Vane's men fell back, some limping, some bleeding, all shaken by the resistance they'd faced. Calvin pinned Vane to the ground, eyes wild with protective rage. Rosalie stepped forward, breathing hard. "It's over, Vane. Go back and tell your masters. We don't belong to anyone now." Vane spat at her feet, but Calvin hauled him upright and shoved him toward his battered gang. "Go," Clara shouted, "and don't come back." The outcasts watched in silence as the sheriff and his broken men slunk away, leaving Red Hollow Mine scarred, but standing. For the first time, Rosalie felt the weight of fear lift. They had won, not just survival, but dignity, agency, and a future that belonged to them. That night, as the fires burned bright outside the mine and the group celebrated their victory, Rosalie looked around at the battered, grinning faces of her new family. She realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand together and fight for something better. She was no longer the outcast, no longer just her father's daughter. She was her own person, and she had sparked a rebellion that would echo across the prairie. In the aftermath of the showdown at Red Hollow Mine, a heavy silence settled over the prairie. For the first time in memory, Rosalie and the outcasts slept without fear of midnight raids or the thunder of Vane's men riding up on them. Their bodies bore the bruises and wounds of battle, but their spirits soared. The impossible had happened. They had stood up to the barons and won. And now, for the first time, a different question filled the air. What next? It was Calvin who first put words to the hope blooming in their hearts. He gathered everyone near the mine entrance on a cool morning, the sky still pink with sunrise. "We fought for our right to be here," he said, voice steady. "Why not make this place ours, for good? Why not build something new, somewhere we can live honest without fear." There was a hush, then Margaret's soft reply. "You mean a real town? For folks like us?" Calvin nodded, and soon the idea grew, taking root in every battered soul. They walked the land beyond the mine, seeking a patch where the earth was soft and a little creek ran between cottonwoods. Rosalie felt her heart catch as she looked out across the endless, empty prairie. Once, this land had only meant exile and hardship. Now it felt like possibility. Work began the very next day. The outcasts, once united only by pain, now found a new purpose. Clara directed the men and women with fierce practicality, mapping out where homes might stand and where to dig a well. Calvin and Big Joe took to the riverbank with shovels, carving a channel so water would reach their new fields. Margaret and the other women gathered wild seeds and hunted edible roots, determined to feed the growing community. Everyone pitched in, even the children. Sam, limping but proud, carried water and watched for snakes in the tall grass. Ruth and Annabelle helped Rosalie mend torn shirts and stitch together blankets from whatever scraps they could find. At night, they gathered around a single fire, sharing food, laughter, and plans for the future. Rosalie felt herself change with every sunrise. Where she once woke expecting shame or loss, she now woke with a sense of responsibility. She was no longer just the girl her father had cast aside. She was a builder, a leader, someone others depended on. She found herself learning from everyone. The way Margaret made soup from almost nothing. The way Clara organized the work crews. The way Calvin built sturdy walls with nothing but scavenged wood and a little ingenuity. They decided on a name for their settlement after much debate. It was Ruth who finally suggested it. How about Sanctuary, for what this place has become? The name stuck. They marked it with a wooden sign at the trail's edge, painted by Sam's careful hand. Of course, not every day was easy. Supplies ran low, tempers sometimes flared, and rumors of Vane or the Barons returning cast long shadows. But the people of Sanctuary refused to let fear rule them. Whenever trouble threatened, they faced it together. Once, a group of drifters approached, looking for easy pickings. Rosalie and Clara met them at the edge of the field, rifles slung across their backs, eyes steely. The drifters moved on, and word spread quickly that Sanctuary was not a place to be trifled with. The hardest challenge was trust. Many of the newcomers, runaways, battered women, former laborers, had been hurt so often they expected betrayal at every turn. It took time for them to accept the kindness of strangers, to believe that this place was truly different. Rosalie, remembering her own scars, went out of her way to welcome each new arrival, offering food, work, and a place by the fire. One evening, as the first crop of corn poked up through the soil and the walls of the new meeting hall were nearly finished, Rosalie walked alone under the stars. The prairie wind was warm, carrying the scent of earth and new growth. She found Calvin by the creek, his boots dangling in the water, looking up at the sky. He smiled when she sat beside him. "We did it, Rosalie. We really did." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside her bones. "We're just getting started," she said. "There's so much more to build, schools, gardens, homes for everyone. But for the first time, I feel like I belong somewhere. Like maybe this is what family was supposed to feel like." Calvin slipped his hand into hers. "Family isn't blood, not really. It's the people you choose to stand beside no matter what. The ones who see you, all of you, and stay anyway." Rosalie closed her eyes. listening to the laughter drifting from the fire. The steady hum of insects, the promise of a new dawn. For the first time, she did not fear the future. Whatever came, Sanctuary would face it together. In the weeks that followed, the little settlement grew. More outcasts and wanderers found their way there, each with their own burdens, each bringing a new skill or dream. Together, they raised barns, dug wells, and planted orchards. Together, they forged rules not of power and fear, but of fairness and respect. And always, Rosalie remembered the lesson she'd learned in exile. True worth isn't given, it's chosen. Day after day, in kindness, courage, and the stubborn will to belong. Years passed, and the wild land that had once been only a refuge for the desperate and dispossessed transformed into something extraordinary. The settlement called Sanctuary, born out of pain and resistance, now stood as a beacon on the endless prairie, a place where anyone, no matter their past, could find dignity, work, and a sense of home. It was a place built on broken beginnings, but shaped by hope, loyalty, and the courage to imagine a different future. Rosalie Boone was no longer the young woman cast out in disgrace, nor simply the figurehead of the rebellion that changed Dusty Ben's balance of power. She had become something rarer, a respected founder, a mentor, a friend, and for many, the living heart of Sanctuary. Her hair had grown longer, sun-bleached and streaked with silver at the temples. Her hands, once soft, now bore the marks of labor, proof that she had built something real from the ground up. In the heart of Sanctuary, a great oak tree spread its branches over the main square, casting welcome shade during the long, hot summers. Around it, the town had blossomed. Tidy houses with porches crowded by laughing children, rows of vegetable gardens, a sturdy schoolhouse, and a meeting hall where disputes were settled by votes rather than violence. Calvin and the other original outcasts built a corral for wild horses, mustangs rescued from Baron's traps, now free to run or serve as trusted companions. On summer evenings, the people of Sanctuary gathered under the oak to share food and stories, a tradition that had grown with each passing year. New arrivals, runaways, drifters, widows with children, even a handful of repentant former deputies, were welcomed with a meal and a seat by the fire. All that was asked in return was respect, hard work, and an open heart. Rosalie watched it all with a quiet pride, always remembering the price they had paid for this fragile peace. Sometimes she would walk the perimeter at dusk, remembering her first days of exile. The humiliation, the hunger, the nights she believed she would never belong anywhere again. She would pause at the grave markers at the edge of town, honoring those lost in the struggle. Margaret, who fell ill the first winter and was mourned by all. Big Joe, who died rescuing a runaway from the river and whose name was now spoken with reverence. The community thrived not because it was perfect, but because its people refused to let anyone fall through the cracks. Disagreements flared, mistakes were made, and hearts were broken, but Sanctuary's greatest law remained unchanged. Everyone had value, and every voice would be heard. Children grew up in this new world, never knowing the old terror of the barrens or the sting of being less than. They learned to read by lantern light, to ride and hunt, to argue respectfully, and to mend fences, both literal and figurative. The schoolmaster was once a gambler who'd lost everything but his mind. The midwife had fled a wealthy house in shame. In Sanctuary, their pasts were part of their story, but never the end. Calvin Reed, Rosalie's partner in survival and in life, became the quiet backbone of the town. He taught the young men and women how to mend saddles, how to tell honest work from a scam, and how to treat a wounded animal with tenderness. He never lost his humility, always crediting others and stepping back so new leaders could rise. On the anniversary of the Red Hollow battle, the people gathered every year for a festival. There was music, food, and a moment of silence for those who had not lived to see the peace they had fought for. Rosalie often spoke then, not as a judge's daughter, but as one of them. She told the new generations the truth. Your worth is not what someone else says you are. It's what you do, how you treat those beside you, and what you choose to fight for. Family is not just blood. Family is built with courage and compassion. Sometimes visitors arrived, travelers with wild tales of trouble beyond the hills, or distant relatives of Sanctuary's earliest residents. Some brought news that Sheriff Vane had disappeared into obscurity, broken by his failures and rejected by his former masters. Others reported that the old barons had lost their power. Their lands, poorly managed and shunned by workers, had gone to ruin. Occasionally, a young woman or frightened boy would come seeking shelter, and the whole town would greet them at the gate, proving that Sanctuary's promise endured. Years blurred into decades. The scars of the past softened, but never disappeared. Rosalie and Calvin grew older, their steps slower, but their spirits undimmed. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the children play in the dust and remembering the journey that brought them here. One night, as a warm breeze drifted through the cottonwoods, Rosalie turned to Calvin. "Do you ever wish it had been easier?" she asked. Calvin smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "Easy never lasts. What we built, what you led us through, will outlast all of us. We made something good, Rosalie. Something that matters." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the truth settle in her heart. "I used to think my life was over the day I was banished, but it was just beginning. Sanctuary was built from the pieces of all our brokenness. Maybe that's what makes it strong." In the end, that was their greatest legacy. Not just a town, but a lesson passed down to every child and newcomer. No one's value is set by birth, wealth, or the judgment of others. Dignity and belonging are forged in struggle, in compassion, and in the daily choice to stand together. The story of Sanctuary was a living reminder that even the most outcast souls can build a family, and that the courage to claim your place in the world, no matter how battered or humble, is the greatest strength of all. And so, as the sun set over the fields they had tamed, Sanctuary thrived, a patch of light on the wild prairie, built by those who once had nowhere else to go, but who, through grit and grace, had found their way home.